and that concerns our Prime Minister, Mr. Shehbaz Sharif, who is on a 2-day official visit to France, where he's participating and representing Pakistan at the new Global Financing Pact summit that has begun in Paris today. More in the following report.
Today's poly crisis are compounding shocks on developing countries, in large part because of an unfair global financial system that is short-term, crisis-prone, and that further exacerbates inequalities. In order to advocate for a reform of the international financial system, Prime Minister Mohammad Shehbaz Sharif is in France on a 2-day official visit to represent Pakistan at the new Global Financing Pact summit. More than 50 countries are participating in the summit to discuss the contours of a new global architecture capable of meeting the challenges of financing sustainable development, environment, energy transition, and climate change agenda. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif will address the summit as leading stakeholder of the G77 and head of one of the largest developing countries most affected by climate change. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif will present Pakistan's perspective and proposals for reform of international financial institutions, climate finance, green infrastructure, attainment of SDGs, and solutions related to debt. Demonstrating his resolve for financial engagement, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is holding productive bilateral meetings with other world leaders on the sidelines of the summit. Pakistan, being one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, has been calling to rethink global financial architecture to make it more responsive to contemporary challenges.
Dr. Usman W. Chohan, leading economist, joins us online. Usman, pleasure to have you on board for this segment of the show. Usman, when it comes to this 2-day new Global Financing Pact summit, how important is this to ascertain the challenges that the countries from the global north and global south are encountering?
I think this summit is a very good occasion, a very important occasion for stakeholders from the G7, G20, and G77 to come to the table and discuss the future of global finance. Well, we've had several lessons come to the surface that were sort of simmering in the background for decades. Recently, one being the COVID-19 pandemic. Alhamdulillah, Pakistan did very well in that. But remember that Pakistan was very articulate in favor of, for example, debt suspension and all of these other financial reforms that the world needed. We were very articulate and we rallied a lot of countries towards that. So we've always played a positive role in articulating a change in global finance. This summit is probably one of the first major steps, and credit to France and Emmanuel Macron as its head to organize this.
All right, now coming to Emmanuel Macron, he said that there is a need for collective efforts to meet global challenges like climate change and alleviation of poverty. Is that achievable in an age where we see so many conflicts and important countries in the global north financing directly or indirectly parties in these conflicts? Don't you feel a lot of the money or the finances are being diverted towards other causes?
Absolutely. You're hitting the nail on the head when you point out that why now and why in this context is this happening, and is it even achievable? Well, it certainly is achievable, but it requires us all to be of one mind, looking at the longer picture of sustainability of our species on this planet even, because the sort of climate distress that we are going to face over the next few decades is going to be very, very disruptive economically, let alone the cost to lives and livelihoods. It's basically the economic structures that will be rattled by this. So we do need to do it. And then you point out in your question about the conflicts and all that. Well, that's very true. In fact, there is a certain irony that France is organizing this. I mean, as far as the structures of global finance goes, you should ask some of these West African countries post-independence what their economic levels of freedom have been because of France. So it's good that France is doing it. It will have to play its own specific national role in that too, because West Africa's development has been hindered in large part because of its relationship to post-colonial France. So there's a lot of things under the surface, and I hope this summit allows for those discussions to take place.
Now, the French President Emmanuel Macron also pointed out toward one thing, and I'd like your point of view on it. He said we have to correct global environment transition. When we have COPs that happen, when we have in summits in Geneva that happen, a lot of pledges are made, but they are never translated into actual action. Do you feel this can happen? How can we correct global environment transition when the actual desire for action isn't present?
Yes, so excellent point. Well, there's two reasons why there's impediments to this. One is at the corporate level in the West, which is to say that not all companies there are eager for this transition. Big oil, for example, has made a ton of money, supernormal or excess profits since 2022, contributing to inflation around the world because energy prices went up. So big oil and big other corporations, including the automotive sector and many other sectors in the West, are not too eager on this. The second conflict comes between the West lecturing the East, or the Global South more specifically, on trying to to slow down economic production and make it more expensive by making it climate friendly, like climate friendly industry or climate friendly manufacturing from the get-go, which makes it expensive and makes it cost prohibitive. So the Global South says, well, you guys have been polluting this planet for 400 years and you've gotten rich, and now you're telling us not to develop and for us to be good kids and not develop, or at least to develop at such a slow rate. Well, that's not fair. We also need a good 400 years to have a good time. And so this conflict between the Global South and the Global North in terms of who should do what is a big concern, because there are very big Global South polluters. As they develop, as their economies speed up, they are contributing. And so the West has a point. But then again, why should the Global South carry the burden for 400 years of polluting by the North? So these are two areas, I think, within the West and then between the West and the East, or the North and the South, that we cannot come to agreements. And you'll feel this at this summit. You feel this at every COP, every summit of this sort. They just cannot come around to this because we understand the challenge, but nobody wants to betray their own interests in this negotiation.
Very good point indeed. And looking at the current geopolitical and geostrategic situation of the world is embroiled in, this is something that we need to see how such summits can pave the way for, as Emmanuel Macron said, a new global financing pact. Speaking of this pact, what do you feel should be the contours of this pact? How do you feel this summit could be a step forward to overhaul the global financial system and the lacunas that exist in it?
Yeah, though that's the key point. There's lacunas in the system. My biggest concern for any equitable or reasonable global financial architecture is the loopholes. When you're trying to fill the bucket up, you have to look for the holes in the bucket, and the biggest hole in the bucket of global prosperity is tax havens, international offshore jurisdictions, the sort of stuff that FATF, which you and I have long been talking about, which should be focusing on that, it instead focuses on other places, and that's really wrong. I mean, a lot of the billions and billions that should be contributed to tax nets around the world, including in rich countries, is being moved to these offshore accounts where they cannot be accessed. They're not useful on those tiny islands anyways, and this is a big bucket hole, and this has to be plugged. We have to look at this lacuna first as the most important thing. The second big thing for global financing is to look at the list of countries that are so severely indebted that they simply will never be able to pay it. There are countries, for example, in Eastern and Central Africa that have too large a GDP to debt mismatch now that it simply would never be possible. And there has to be a sort of debt jubilee. The jubilee concept actually goes to the Torah and the Injil, so the Old and New Testaments, where these kings would actually wipe the slate clean and start the debt process again. And we sort of need that now for a true new global financing pact, the Nouveau Pacte Financier, as the French call it right now. For this to happen, you really need to wipe the slate clean. And that doesn't mean making it zero figures everywhere, but it means that some things just have to be written off now because the 20th century is long gone, and these are the vestiges of that. And
but I like you saying to wiping the slate clean, because that's never going to happen, because this is what the global north will never want it happens, because this puts a certain hold on the countries in the global south. Now coming to developing countries, because this is what our focus is on in this summit as well, there seems to be an unfair global financial system in play, due to which there are irregularities, due to which there are inequalities as far as the developing and the developed countries are concerned. How is this inequitable or unequal financial system affecting countries such as Pakistan?
It affects us in several ways. The biggest way is that we never have the balanced budgets. We never have the fiscal space to develop or invest in our own country. And basically, we are also funding the development of other countries in two ways. For developed countries, and we're parking it in their banks. It's a private decision usually, but the fact is that you're basically bankrolling their development. They have excess savings. That makes their currency stronger, and that makes their currencies more attractive, and they have plenty of wealth. Even when they don't really know what to do, they just sit on it. The second is that even amongst developing countries, countries like Pakistan are basically funding the development of other developing countries rather than their own, because we purchase or import from them, but we don't export to them enough. They don't import for us. For example, tea. We actually don't grow tea. Tea was grown in East Pakistan. That's why it's on our emblem. But we import tea from other third world countries, other developing countries. We are giving foreign exchange for that. Similarly for coal. Similarly for other things, basic commodities that we either cannot or will not grow, decide not to grow, unfortunately. So we are funding them, and we're also funding the developed world. And so ultimately, big countries like ours become fiscally hollow. We don't have enough relative to the size of our economy, the size of our people, to fund further development. That becomes our problem. Then we get into a debt cycle, and we need to borrow to fill that gap, and that is not the right way to keep a sustainable fiscal path.
Usman, I'd like to refer to an official statement that came from Pakistan regarding what our Prime Minister, Mr. Shehbaz Sharif, will be talking about in the summit. He says he will present Pakistan's perspectives and proposals for A, reform of international financial institutions, B, climate finance, C, green infrastructure, and D, attainment of the SDGs and solutions related to debt. What, in your point of view, is or should be Pakistan's vision to fight inequalities and the attainment of the SDGs?
Now, there's many factors, and I'm sure our delegation there will raise them accordingly. The first is for the push towards renewables, the financing of renewables. Keep in mind that renewables are such a success story now in the world because of huge subsidies over the 20th century. So that sort of subsidization has to continue in places where it is still cost prohibitive. So the renewable part. The second, with the climate sustainability, is that the sort of carbon tax and other means of sort of distributing the gains and the losses more evenly of this, because we're very climate vulnerable. We can talk about that. The third is in terms of, again, we may not say that they'll forgive all debt to all countries, but to reduce, take a haircut, or extend the maturity, or reduce the coupon. Some debt restructuring stuff has to happen, and probably the discussion about how existing institutions as well as new institutions can have vehicles to fund climate-friendly or pro-poverty, like eradicating poverty measures. Those sorts of things can exist even within the existing system, as well as adding new appendages, new institutions to that system. So we have a lot to discuss, because we are particularly feeling this already earlier. Everyone will feel it, but we're feeling it earlier than others.
We are feeling it also because of the floods that hampered Pakistan's economy last year and continues to hamper because of the effects that have reeled as a result of those, and to couple that with other issues that Pakistan's economy is suffering from. Pakistan has been calling for finding a long-term and comprehensible solution to the debt problem as far as the least developed countries is concerned. Usman, what are the prospects of any kind of breakthrough during these 2 days?
Well, I would say the prospects are higher than one might expect, because one approaches these things with a sort of cynicism, right, generally. But that was pre-COVID. Now I think that because of the situation in which this is being organized, it is much likelier to happen. The reason I believe that France is taking such a lead is because France and Europe more generally is cautious about where the world is headed and what its role is, because it is now characterized by a strong US-China antagonism. right? So this rivalry, where does Europe find itself in that? So in order to keep themselves relevant and be a positive contributor, they have to sort of look at how the existing system, which doesn't work for anybody anymore, can be made so that they find a place for it, and it also does good for others. And you are familiar with Macron's recent visit to China and his external diplomacy, and even within the EU. This means that one of the key pillars of the global economy, Europe, is wanting to find its place and keep everybody in some positive contributory stance, rather than antagonize and rupture the global economy, particularly when there is a war on the Eastern Front of the EU.
But that will be very tough for the European Union to kind of create and maintain a certain balance as far as all these factors are concerned. Now, the United Nations in 2022, that is last year, had talked about a reversal of human development in 9 out of the 10 countries in the globe, which is driven by a decrease in life expectancy and a rise in poverty. Do you feel a summit such as this can kind of move in the right direction as far as aligning different agendas to bring meaningful change in this respect is concerned?
It can, because I believe that the realization of the big trends is now among all stakeholders around the world. Even if they may not agree with each other's interests, they all see the bigger picture. The bigger picture involves several parts. One is that the population growth in the developed world is still very low. It's negative in many places, so their workforces are disappearing, which means that their social safety nets will erode, which means that they have to look at immigration and other factors more carefully, while in the developing world there is perhaps an excess of population relative to education, fiscal investment, healthcare, etc. So this mismatch is one big one. The second is that the West is becoming increasingly economically irrelevant, not just Europe, but the West as a whole, through the de-dollarization process that was accelerated by 2022, the war in Ukraine, the dollar was weaponized, and so on. Not many countries are too keen on holding strictly to dollars, and in fact diversifying portfolios is another big factor. And the third is what you're well aware of, we've discussed, is the climate thing. This is already affecting countries in ways that they, even if they don't publicly disseminate, their scientists are telling the governments it's a big deal now. You cannot keep doing things the way they are. So these big trends, I think everybody understands. So even if they don't like each other, they have to come to the table and talk.
Now, let's come back to the whole principle of this two-day summit. It's a new Global Financing Pact summit. Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, says, and I quote, "The global financial system is simply not fit for the purpose." In your point of view, what are the key reforms that are needed, required to make this international financial system more viable?
The first is, again, the tax loopholes, plugging that hole in the bucket of prosperity. The tax havens, things cannot continue. This is some aberration. Even capitalism does not expect for this to happen. The second is on the debt issues and the debt sustainability. The third is for trying to have a system where lending is depoliticized. So, for example, investing in development of countries or extending finance or credit has to be depoliticized. This is very important. And the fourth is to have a more, if not multipolar, then non-polar world where more currencies and more agents can participate freely without the mediation of a single currency or a single institution. These four things, I think, are very important for a new, true financing pact, a truly new financing pact.
But you know, we all talk about something new, a new financing pact, new measures, new pledges, whether it be COP, whether it be Geneva, whether it be this new Global Financing Pact summit. It all seems so good on paper, but in actual reality of things, little is done. There are, as I said again, I'll repeat the word, pledges made, but those pledges are never translated more or less into action. Pakistan and other countries pollute less, but are more or less the most affected countries as far as climate change is concerned. I am referring to green financing or climate financing that has been talked about many a times in different summits, including this one. Will this summit pave way for a green transition across the world, irrespective of it being in the global north or south?
I hope so, but I don't think this summit alone will do it. We need to have more summits like these until one breakthrough does happen, because if you leave it to one meeting, what are the chances that everybody will act in unanimity? And of course, you can argue that, well, there's been plenty of COPs, there have been plenty of other international summitry, but the major breakthroughs where we realize I don't want it to happen at a time when it is too late. And thankfully for now, we all have time on our hands. And it also requires two other dynamics to change. One, which we talked about earlier, is that within the West, the corporate impediments have to cede to the bigger interest, the global interest. And the second is that even without international financing in Pakistan, if we get our economy working for the people and start to make long-term investments, we have enough capital on our own to do the things we need to do. We need to dam the rivers. We need to reforest the Banjar Ilake, the barren lands,
Barren areas.
barren areas. So
Mm.
there's things that we can do on our own too, and we may have to at some point.
Now, speaking of doing things on our own, the current coalition government in Pakistan has decided to put up a special investment facilitation council that has a mandate to frame economic policies that could ensure policy predictability, continuity, effective implementation to revive our economy. What, in your point of view, is the prospect to attract investment for this initiative from this very summit?
I would keep the SIFC as a domestic thing, and it's as far from the ideal way to arrange economic policy, because you're not taking public inputs, you're not doing it in a democratic manner, and not everybody on that panel is an expert on economics. So I don't think that's ideal, but we keep that separate as a domestic issue, and we look at what we have, where Pakistan can rally support for its interest that is shared with the world. Pakistan is very good at that. Pakistan is very good at diplomacy, historically. And in the COVID-19 thing, we did an excellent job with the Desk Suspension Service Initiative, a DSSI it was called. And this is similar to that in terms of us rallying other countries to say, enough is enough now. We need to put finance where our priorities are. Finance is made, capital is made up. It's an invented human thing. So can it be used to create real material benefits for mankind? Or is it just something that we do on the side while we plunder the planet? There should be more synergy between these. And Pakistan has a very important role in that because we are suffering first and foremost, but we know that others are too. So we can get everybody on the same page.
Let's continue to stay cautiously optimistic as far as the outcome of this summit is concerned and keep our fingers crossed. 50 countries are here. Let's hope some kind of positive development comes out of it, and the world kind of understands and moves towards the right initiatives in order to sustain itself. Thank you so very much, Usman, to have joined us. That was Dr. Usman W. Chohan, leading economist, talking to us about the new Global Financing Pact summit that has begun in Paris. It's a two-day summit for which there's a delegation that has gone from Pakistan that is headed by our Prime Minister, Mr. Mohammad Shehbaz Sharif. Let's